Your devotion today, the topic is freedom. And it's something that if you've trusted Christ has already been delivered to you. But the reality is many believers don't live in the freedom that Christ has already purchased. It is so easy to go back under the expectations of others rather than live in the freedom that Christ has delivered. Galatians 5:1 says this, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." Now the command here is that we've been called to stand firm in freedom, because the reality is, if we're not careful, we're going to slip back into bondage. Early on in the book of Galatians, in chapter 1, verse 10, he says, "Am I seeking the approval of man or of God? If I'm trying to be approved by man, I'm not a bondservant of Christ." The reality is this, is that when you and I spend our lives serving Christ, there's a freedom that we experience. But when we come under the expectation of others, there's a bondage that we fall into. So Paul's concern is that you and I are going to fall into bondage as opposed to living in the freedom that Christ has delivered. Now Christ referred to this in John chapter 8. Let me read John chapter 8:34. He said, "Truly I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. But if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." In other words, if you've been set free by Christ, you are free. The question is, are you living in the freedom that Christ has already delivered? Now in Romans chapter 6, this is addressed. In Romans chapter 6, what you have going on is there are many believers who are being invited to participate in big sin. And what he's trying to show them in Romans chapter 6 is that if you've been freed through faith in Christ Jesus, you can't go back to your old ways, because Christ has called you and He's raised you to walk in newness of life. In Romans chapter 6, verse 7, it says, "The one who has died in Christ has been set free from sin." Now if we have died with Christ, we believe we'll also live with Him. Here's what He's trying to get you to realize. That if you've trusted Christ for your salvation, you've been set free from the mastery of sin. It's no longer your master. You do not have to say yes to your temptations anymore. You do not have to indulge in your desires anymore. Christ has freed you to serve Him rather than yourself. And then he says this. This is actually the first command in the book of Romans. It's Romans 6:11. "Consider yourself to be dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus." Here's the calling. God has called you to consider yourself dead to the cravings and dead to the desires and dead to the mastery of your sin, so that you can now say yes to His Word and yes to His Spirit. Here's what you need to know. You are no longer a slave to your cravings. You've been set free. And what He wants you to understand in Galatians 5 today is Christ has set you free, so stand firm. Don't stand firm in your old convictions that life is all about you, but stand firm in your new convictions that life is all about Christ, and trust God by His Spirit to renew your heart in such a way that you can live in the freedom that He has delivered for you today.